Today's reading from Ezra should strike you as a little odd, even embarrassing in its own way. It will likely strike you as, well, a little uncharitable, because it flies in the face of our desire to be as open and inclusive as possible. But there may be a lesson here for us, even if it's not immediately obvious. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas, and this is your daily devotional for Thursday, January 6th, 2022. When the exiles started returning from Babylon and wherever else they had been sent in exile, it wasn't all sweetness and light. There were people who had not been exiled and who had stayed in the land, and there was friction between those who had remained and those who were returning. If you stop and think about it, this is perfectly normal and natural. They had been separated for many years, and their histories had begun to diverge. So, when the exiles began to return, one of the critical challenges facing them was to determine who belonged and who didn't, who was a Jew and who wasn't. The second chapter of Ezra is one of those chapters that consists of lists of family names that don't mean a lot to you and me, so we tend to skim over them. But the end of the chapter contains a curious event that, as I said a moment ago, may strike you as odd. Here's what it says. The following were those who came up from Tel Melah, Tel Harsha, Cherub, Adon, and Immer, though they could not prove their families or their descent, whether they belonged to Israel. The descendants of Deliah, Tobiah, and Nekoda, 652. Also of the descendants of the priests, the descendants of Habiah, Hakaz, and Barzillai, who had married one of the daughters of Barzillai the Gileadite and was called by their name. These looked for their entries in the genealogical records, but they were not found there, and so they were excluded from the priesthood as unclean. The governor told them that they were not to partake of the most holy food until there should be a priest to consult Urim and Thummim. There are two issues here, both related to the issue of identity. The first concerns a group of returning exiles who couldn't conclusively prove their Jewish ancestry. The second concerns a subgroup of returning exiles claiming to be descendants from the priestly class, but who couldn't find their names in the genealogical records. This is a very different set of issues from what you and I experience today, a very different frame of reference. Our major concern is to bring in as many people as possible into the faith, into the church. The concern among the returning exiles, on the other hand, was to exclude anyone who could not prove that they were actual descendants of Jews. Why is that? Well, the short answer is that for them, being Jewish wasn't a matter of choice. You either were born into it or you weren't. The first issue facing the returning exiles then was to rebuild their people, almost literally from the ground up. And that meant determining as best they could who truly belonged. Again, it's a little hard for us to understand, but to be Jewish, especially then, was to be part of God's chosen people, a people whose very reason for being was to be set apart from all other people, to be holy. One day we'll explore the ins and outs of all of this, but for now, it's important just to know that it was important to them to know who was and who wasn't part of their group so that they could continue to be a distinct people set apart for God's purposes in the world. So, what, if anything, does this have to do with us? Simply this. First, even if we think of ourselves as radically inclusive, every group has certain boundaries that define what the group stands for. It may seem ironic, but even a group dedicated to inclusivity has its boundaries, excluding those who reject the group's premise, the group's very reason for being. Second, this story from Ezra reminds us that as God's people, we have a mission to perform. We too have a reason for being. Only now, membership in the group isn't defined by genetics, but rather by belief, by God's choice. We believe that we've been welcomed into the household of God's people through Jesus Christ. But our mission actually remains remarkably similar to Israel's mission in the world. We are to be a people set apart for God's purpose of blessing the world through our presence. The difference is that we don't believe that membership is defined by inheritance. We are part of God's people because God has welcomed us in. Tomorrow, it's time to rebuild the temple. But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.